My name is Naomi, and at 34 years old, I learned that grief brings out the absolute worst in people. Exactly 1 week after I buried my husband Marcus, I found myself standing in my sister Chloe, U.S. lavish Atlanta backyard, surrounded by our entire church congregation. I was supposed to be celebrating my nephew E's first birthday. Instead, my sister clinked her champagne glass and announced to over 100 people that her baby was my late husband, us child. If that betrayal was not enough, her husband Trevor threw a piece of paper onto the catered table, claiming it was an updated will, demanding half of my $800,000 home. The entire yard gasped, waiting for me to break down. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at her smug face and tried to hold back my laughter, because they had no idea that I held a medical secret that made her entire story impossible. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always catches up to greedy people. The Georgia heat was suffocating that Sunday afternoon, but the heaviness in my chest had nothing to do with the weather. It had only been 7 days since I watched them lower Marcus into the ground. 7 days of waking up and reaching for a man who was no longer there. My heart was shattered, but in my family attendance was never optional. My father Thomas was the senior pastor of one of the largest megachurches in Atlanta, and my mother Vivian was his fiercely image-obsessed first lady. To them, family unity was a brand that needed constant marketing. We were supposed to be the absolute epitome of Black excellence. Skipping my nephew U.S. birthday because I was grieving would have been deemed a public relations disaster for the church. So I put on a tailored emerald green dress, forced a smile, and drove to the upscale gated community where my sister lived. The moment I walked through the wrought iron gates into their sprawling backyard, the judgment began. The yard was filled with members of our church congregation, local politicians, and Trevor O.'s wealthy investor friends. Before I could even reach the gift table, my mother intercepted me. She did not offer a hug or ask how I was sleeping. Instead, her eyes scanned my outfit with sharp disapproval. She pulled me aside, her voice dropping to that harsh whisper she reserved exclusively for my failures. She told me I could have at least tried to look more festive, adjusting the collar of her own designer suit. She hissed at me not to walk around looking like a rain cloud and ruining my sister's perfect day. She reminded me how hard Chloe had worked to put this event together. Chloe had always been the golden child. She was the one who fit my parents' perfect mold. She was a beautiful socialite who went to medical school just long enough to secure a ring from a man they believed elevated our family status. Trevor loved to flaunt his generational wealth and play the white savior to our family, making sure everyone knew he was the one funding Chloe's lavish lifestyle. I, on the other hand, was the black sheep. I had refused to join the church administration, choosing instead to build my own public relations firm from scratch. My independence was always viewed as rebellion. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded at my mother, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I made my way toward the patio where Chloe was holding her son, posing for photographs. Trevor stood beside her, sipping a bourbon and laughing loudly with one of the church deacons. When Trevor saw me, his smile did not reach his cold eyes. He announced loudly enough for several people to hear that he was glad I could crawl out of my house. He smirked and said they were not sure I would show up, figuring I might be too busy managing those low-level local clients of mine since my little agency was barely breaking even these days. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I told him it was my nephew's birthday and I would not miss it for anything. Chloe finally turned to me, her face glowing with a strange manic energy. She handed the baby to a nanny and grabbed a fresh glass of champagne. She told me she was so glad I was there, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. In fact, she had been waiting for me to arrive before making her big toast. She raised her glass and asked everyone to gather around. The backyard slowly quieted down. The string quartet stopped playing. Over 100 guests turned their attention to the center of the patio where Chloe stood on the elevated stone steps. My father and mother moved to stand proudly right behind her, painting the perfect picture of supportive parents. Chloe thanked everyone for coming to celebrate her precious boy. She projected her voice so every single church member could hear. She said this past year had been full of incredible blessings, but also terrible tragedy. She paused, wiping away a fake tear, and reminded everyone that we had recently lost my husband Marcus. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. People cast pitying glances my way. I stood frozen, gripping my purse strings. But Chloe was not done. She said Marcus did not leave us completely. He left a piece of himself behind. A legacy. She pointed her manicured finger directly at me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. She announced that for the past year she had carried a heavy burden, but in honor of Marcus' passing she could no longer lie. She declared that her son was not Trevor Yu's biological child, he was Marcus' son. The silence that fell over the backyard was deafening. It was the kind of absolute shock that sucks all the oxygen out of the air. A woman in the front row actually dropped her plate. I heard someone gasp and whisper a prayer. My brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of her words. My sister was standing in front of our entire community, claiming she had an affair with my husband, claiming her child belonged to the man I just buried. Before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, Trevor stepped forward. He did not look angry like a betrayed husband should. Instead, he looked victorious. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick, folded document. He walked straight up to me and threw it aggressively onto the catered table right in front of where I stood. Trevor's voice boomed with arrogant authority as he claimed her story was true. He spun a lie that Marcus came to him right before his tragic death, confessed everything, and wanted to make things right. He pointed at the document and said Marcus had formally updated his will. He claimed this paper proved Marcus acknowledged the boy as his own flesh and blood. According to Trevor, the will dictated that half of the Beacon Hill estate I lived in belonged to this child. He demanded that I hand over the house. He sneered that I was just a struggling public relations agent anyway, that I could not afford the upkeep, and ordered me to sign the deed over to them today. I stared at the papers lying on the table. It was a typed document complete with a notary stamp and a signature that looked remarkably like Marcus Us. The blatant criminality of what they were attempting was staggering. We had bought that house together, poured our life savings into it, and turned it into a sanctuary. Now they were trying to steal my $800,000 home using a fabricated affair and a forged legal document. I looked up expecting my parents to intervene. I expected my father, the righteous pastor, to shut down this circus. But to my absolute horror, my parents stepped forward and flanked Chloe. My mother Vivian marched up to me, her face contorted with rage. She hissed at me, asking how I could let this happen. Her voice vibrated with venom as she accused me of not being able to keep my own husband satisfied in my own bed. She said I pushed him away with my obsession with my business and drove him right into my sister Us arms. She called me an absolute disgrace to the family and a failure as a wife. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could utter a single syllable, my mother raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed across the silent patio. My cheek burned instantly. The congregation gasped again, but nobody stepped forward to help me. The woman who gave birth to me, the first lady of our congregation, had just assaulted me in front of the very community I grew up in, all to protect the daughter who was actively trying to rob me blind. My father stood tall, adjusting his tie, looking down at me with cold disappointment. He commanded me to sign the papers, his voice echoing with his pulpit authority. He told me not to make this any uglier than it already was, claiming my sister needed to provide for her child. He declared they would not let me drag the family name through the mud with a messy court battle over a house. He demanded I do what was right for the family and transfer the property immediately to avoid a scandal. I stood there surrounded by over 100 people who were judging me, pitying me, and waiting for me to break down and surrender. I felt the stinging heat on my face where my mother had struck me. I looked at Trevor, a smug face relishing his perceived victory. I looked at Chloe clutching her pearls, acting the victim while attempting to steal my life us work. Slowly, I raised my hand and wiped a small smudge of lipstick from the corner of my mouth. I looked down at the forged will on the table. Then I let out a soft chuckle. The chuckle grew into a genuine, relaxed laugh. The sound of my laughter unnerved them. Chloe took a step back, her fake confidence faltering. Trevor frowned, crossing his arms defensively. My mother glared at me, clenching her fists. She spat at me, asking if I had lost my mind and what was so funny. I took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of my green dress, holding my head higher than ever before. I looked right at my mother and asked if she wanted to know why I was laughing at this pathetic performance. I asked if she wanted to know why I found it absolutely hilarious that Chloe was claiming Marcus fathered her child. I paused, letting the suspense hang in the hot Georgia air as every single person leaned in closer. I stated clearly, making sure every syllable landed like a physical blow, that Marcus had testicular cancer when he was 22 years old. He had a bilateral orchiectomy. That means both of his testicles were completely removed 10 years before he even met me. Marcus was completely naturally, undeniably sterile. I looked straight at Chloe and told her that unless she figured out how to get pregnant by a ghost, that baby was not his. And that will Trevor just threw on the table was nothing but a one-way ticket to federal prison for fraud. The absolute silence that followed my words was heavier than the suffocating Georgia humidity pressing down on us. Over 100 people stood entirely motionless like statues in a museum of hypocrisy. The string quartet remained frozen, their bows hovering awkwardly over their instruments, while the catering staff stopped mid-pour, champagne bottles suspended in the air. The church deacons, the local politicians, the wealthy investors, all of them simply stopped breathing. The only sound in the entire sprawling backyard was the faint rhythmic clinking of ice melting in the abandoned crystal glasses scattered across the tables. I watched the blood completely drain from Chloe's face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost beneath her expensive, flawless spray tan. Her perfectly rehearsed victim performance shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. She looked wildly at Trevor, her manicured hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped her drink onto the pristine stone patio. She had expected me to crumble, to run away, crying in shame, allowing them to effortlessly take control of the narrative and my home. She had not expected me to publicly announce my late husband's deepest physical vulnerability, just to expose her vile, calculating lie. For a fleeting second, I saw raw, unadulterated panic in my sister's eyes as she realized the entire congregation had just caught her committing perjury against a dead man. But if I thought catching them in an undeniable biological impossibility would make them back down, I severely underestimated the sheer audacity of Trevor. Any normal man caught red-handed trying to steal a grieving widow's home using a fabricated affair would have recoiled in absolute shame. He would have apologized, grabbed his wife, and fled the premises. Not Trevor. He did not flinch. He did not stutter. The arrogant white savior complex that had always fueled his condescending interactions with my family kicked into a terrifying overdrive. His face flushed with an ugly mottled red, not from embarrassment, but from pure, unadulterated rage that a black woman was defying him in front of his carefully curated audience. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, bridging the gap, until I could smell the overpowering stench of his bourbon and his heavy, expensive designer cologne. With a sharp, violent motion, he snatched the forged document right back off the catered table, crumpling the edges in his large fist, as if the paper itself had offended him. He let out a harsh, mocking bark of laughter that echoed sharply off the stone patio, a sound so devoid of empathy it made my skin crawl. "Cancer! So what if he had cancer?" Trevor yelled, his voice booming with a terrifying lack of remorse, completely unfazed by the lie I had just dismantled. He doubled down, shifting his narrative so incredibly fast it would give you whiplash. "So the kid is not his biologically. That does not change a single thing about this document, Naomi. This will is fully notarized. It has your husband's real signature on it. It is a legally binding contract, and your pathetic medical history lesson does not negate the law." He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into cold, hateful slits. He pointed his index finger right in my face and raised his voice even louder, ensuring every single member of my father's congregation heard his poison. Marcus came to me because he realized what a monumental failure you were as a wife. He knew you were hopelessly obsessed with your failing public relations business, and he was sick to death of coming home to a cold, empty house. He wanted Chloe and my nephew to have the estate because you are entirely useless as a woman. You could not even give him a real family. Trevor paused, letting the cruelty of his words hang in the humid air before delivering his final blow. He thought you were worthless, Naomi. He saw that you were a barren disappointment, and he wanted this property to go to a real family who actually deserves it. You are going to lose the house today. My legal team is the best in Atlanta. We will bury you in litigation so deep you will not be able to afford a cardboard box, let alone a historic property in Beacon Hill. You are nothing but a struggling PR agent, and you do not stand a chance against me. The sheer brazenness of his words struck me like a physical blow to the chest, knocking the wind out of my lungs, but I absolutely refused to let him see me bleed. He was deliberately weaponizing the deepest, most private trauma of my marriage. Marcus and I had spent years crying behind closed doors over our inability to have children. We had navigated the absolute heartbreak of infertility together, holding each other through the darkest, most painful nights of our lives. We had mourned the nursery we never got to paint and the future we had to rewrite. And now this arrogant grifter was twisting our sacred shared tragedy into a cheap weapon to steal the sanctuary we had lovingly built together. I stared at the crumpled piece of paper in his aggressive fist. I knew Marcus's signature intimately, and I knew the notary stamp was likely acquired through one of Trevor's shady real estate associates. I also knew Trevor's supposed generational wealth was a complete illusion, a fragile house of cards built on massive debt and leveraging other people's money. That was exactly why they were so desperately gunning for my $800,000 home. They were financially drowning, suffocating under the weight of their own lavish lies, and trying to use my husband's fresh grave as a life raft to save themselves. A restless, uncomfortable murmur began to ripple through the sprawling backyard. The initial shock was wearing off, and the congregation was finally processing the grotesque nature of the scene playing out before them. Women in large, elaborate Sunday hats were whispering frantically behind their hands. One of the senior church elders shook his head, looking thoroughly disgusted by the display. They had just watched a wealthy man brutally berate a woman who had buried her husband exactly 7 days ago, attacking her infertility in front of her entire community. The atmosphere grew thick with a volatile, heavy tension. Every eye in the yard slowly turned toward the elevated patio steps where my parents stood. My father, Pastor Thomas, was the ultimate moral authority of our community. His booming voice guided thousands toward righteousness every single Sunday. He was the shepherd of this flock, the man who preached about protecting the vulnerable and uplifting the brokenhearted. The crowd was waiting for him to step down, to physically put himself between me and the man violently assaulting my character. They were waiting for the righteous anger of a father protecting his grieving, widowed daughter. I looked up at my father, my heart pounding against my ribs, silently praying that for once in my 34 years of life, he would actually choose me over the family brand. I prayed he would look at the obvious forged document, look at Trevor's aggressive, threatening posture, and shut this entire sickening circus down. Thomas adjusted his expensive silk tie. He cleared his throat, a deep resonant sound that instantly commanded absolute silence across the lawn. He took a deliberate, measured step down from the patio. My mother Vivian followed closely right beside him, her face a mask of rigid, terrifying perfection. But they did not walk toward Trevor. They did not order him out of my face or demand he leave the property. Instead, my parents stepped directly in front of me, turning their backs on Chloe and Trevor, forming a unified wall of opposition against their own eldest daughter. The absolute betrayal of that movement hit me harder than the moment Chloe had announced her fake affair. "Naomi, that is enough," my father commanded. His voice did not carry the warmth or comfort of a loving parent. It held the cold, authoritative timbre he used when reprimanding unapologetic sinners from his pulpit. He looked at me with an expression of profound, unmasked disgust. You are making a public spectacle of yourself and bringing immense shame to this family. Your sister is highly emotional and perhaps she misspoke in her grief about the exact nature of her relationship with Marcus. But Trevor is absolutely right about the legality of this situation. Dad? I whispered, my voice cracking for the very first time, the betrayal tearing at my throat. He is trying to steal my home. He is lying to your face and mocking my marriage. He is executing Marcus's final wishes. My father projected his voice over my quiet plea, ensuring the congregation heard his official pastoral decree. Marcus was an incredibly generous man, a man who truly understood the importance of legacy. He knew Chloe was providing the next generation for this family. It is entirely reasonable and just that he would want to ensure his nephew was well provided for. You are fighting against your own husband's generosity out of pure, unadulterated selfishness. We will not allow you to disrespect his memory by fighting this will in court and dragging our church's good name through the mud. Before I could even begin to process the absolute moral bankruptcy of my father's words, my mother stepped closer. She grabbed my arm, her impeccably manicured nails digging so sharply into my bare skin that I almost gasped in pain. She leaned in, positioning herself so her harsh, venomous whisper would only reach my ears, while presenting a sickeningly sweet smile of maternal concern to the watching crowd. "You selfish little girl!" Vivian hissed, her breath hot and furious against my cheek. "You have always ruined absolutely everything. You have no children. You have no future. Chloe has a growing family to raise and Trevor's business desperately needs capital right now. You are going to sign that deed over to them tomorrow morning, or your father will stand before the entire congregation this Sunday and announce that you are a greedy, mentally unstable widow who abandoned her family in their time of need. We will ruin your public relations agency. You will have no clients, no reputation, and no one left in this city." I looked at the three of them standing united against me. Trevor standing tall with a victorious smirk, clutching the fraudulent document like a trophy. Chloe wiping fake tears, dabbing at her eyes while peeking out from behind her husband to see if the crowd was buying the new narrative. And my own parents, the esteemed pillars of the community, willingly acting as accomplices to a federal crime just to fund their golden child's extravagant lifestyle and protect their pristine image. They completely expected me to surrender. They expected the crushing weight of their combined authority, the trauma of my fresh grief, and the terrifying threat of public excommunication to break my spirit entirely. They thought they had cornered the black sheep, leaving me with no option but to sign away my sanctuary to buy their conditional peace. But they had made one fatal, irreversible miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the woman Marcus had loved, and they had absolutely no idea about the true devastating arsenal of evidence I had sitting safely inside my designer purse. I stood there as Trevor's spit practically flew into my face, the sheer venom of his words hanging heavily in the humid Georgia air. He was looming over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. The crowd around us began to shift, pressing inward. I could feel the psychological walls closing in, a familiar sensation from my childhood. I was being backed into a corner, completely surrounded by a sea of hostile, judgmental faces looking for any crack in my armor. It was the classic dynamic of my family: isolate the black sheep, crush her spirit, and force her to comply with the narrative that best served my parents' pristine public image. My father stepped forward again, his pastoral presence practically radiating hypocritical righteousness. Instead of rebuking the man who had just cruelly mocked my infertility and my dead husband, Thomas placed a heavy, unforgiving hand on my shoulder. His grip was entirely too tight. He leaned down, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a Sunday morning sermon designed to guilt his congregation into submission. He told me that my stubbornness was a sin. He said that a true Christian woman, a proper daughter of the church, would embrace forgiveness and charity. He actually had the nerve to suggest that Marcus would have wanted me to step aside and let Trevor manage the property, implying that my grief was making me hysterical and greedy. Before I could even shrug his heavy hand off my shoulder, my mother lunged into the space between us. Vivian's face was completely flushed, the veins in her neck protruding against her expensive pearl necklace. The mask of the gracious First Lady was entirely gone, replaced by the bitter, calculating woman I had known my entire life. She snatched the pen from the table and practically shoved it against my chest. "You have always been jealous of Chloe!" She spat, her voice a sharp, jagged blade that sliced through the murmurs of the crowd. "You have been resentful since you were both little girls. You are jealous because she got into medical school and you did not. You are jealous because she had the grace and beauty to marry a successful white man like Trevor, a man who actually provides for her and elevates our family standing. You could not give Marcus children, and now you are trying to punish your sister for being everything you are not. Sign the papers right now, Naomi. Do not make this family bear the shame of your bitter, barren jealousy in front of the entire church." The sheer cruelty of my mother's words drew actual gasps from the deacons and choir members standing on the manicured lawn, but the shock was quickly replaced by a sickening wave of agreement among my parents' closest allies. I saw older women nodding, whispering that I had always been difficult, that I had always rebelled against the traditional path my parents had set for me. They were all so desperate to protect the illusion of Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian's perfect family that they were willing to watch a grieving widow be publicly robbed and humiliated. For 34 years I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had let them diminish my accomplishments. I had stayed silent while they paraded Chloe around like a trophy. I had endured the subtle digs and the outright insults because I believed that holding the family together was my duty. But looking at my mother's contorted, hateful face and looking at the fake, triumphant smirk on my sister's lips, the final thread of my obligation simply snapped. The scared, eager-to-please daughter died right there on that patio, buried right alongside my husband. I let the pen drop from my hand. It clattered loudly against the stone pavers, rolling away until it hit Trevor's expensive leather shoe. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing my mother to take a step back. I looked her dead in the eye, stripping away decades of conditioned submission. "Jealous?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, carrying a cold authority that immediately silenced the remaining whispers in the yard. "You think I am jealous of Chloe? Let us talk about your golden child, Mom. Let us talk about her incredible achievements. You love to brag to the congregation that she went to medical school. Why do you never mention that she dropped out after exactly 1 semester? She did not leave because it was not her passion. She failed out because she spent her tuition money on luxury handbags and failed every single basic anatomy exam. She has never worked a hard day in her life. She is 30 years old and still calls Dad to pay off her credit cards every time she maxes them out on designer shoes she wears to pretend she is rich." Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, looking frantically around at the church members who had just heard her carefully constructed medical background destroyed in 10 seconds flat. My mother opened her mouth to scream at me, but I did not let her speak. I turned my attention directly to Trevor. He puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his posture of superiority, but I saw the slight tremor in his jaw. "And then there is Trevor." I continued pacing slowly across the patio, addressing the crowd as much as my family. "Trevor, the successful white savior you worship so much, Mom. You constantly belittle my career. You call my public relations agency a little hobby. You mock my local clients. But while you were busy trying to force me into a church administration job I never wanted, I built an empire from the ground up. My firm does not just barely break even. I manage multi-million-dollar crisis communications for Fortune 500 companies across the East Coast. My agency brought in over $4 million in pure profit last year alone. I bought the Beacon Hill estate with my own cash under Marcus's and my joint LLC. I do not need anyone to provide for me, let alone a man who leases his entire personality." Trevor's face turned a violent shade of purple. He opened his mouth to shout me down, but I raised my hand, pointing a single accusatory finger right at his chest. "You stand there and call me a failure, Trevor," I said, my voice rising, ringing with absolute certainty. "You claim Marcus wanted to leave his assets to a real man, a successful investor. But we all know what you really are. You are a phony. You are a low-level, unlicensed broker who leverages other people's money to lease luxury cars and rent expensive watches just to impress suburban churchgoers who do not know any better. That is a lie, Trevor bellowed, stepping forward with his fists clenched, trying to physically intimidate me into silence. You are a hysterical, grieving woman, making up desperate lies to keep property that does not belong to you. I manage a highly successful portfolio. I provide for this family. I am a respected investor in this city. My father moved to intervene, his face dark with fury at my insubordination. Naomi, you will stop this slander immediately. You are embarrassing yourself and destroying this family's reputation. Trevor is a pillar of our community. I will not have you attacking his livelihood because you are bitter about Marcus's will. Apologize to him right now. I did not back down. I did not apologize. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my smartphone, unlocking it with a swift, practiced motion. I also pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope that I had brought with me, an envelope that had absolutely nothing to do with a birthday present. You think Trevor is successful, Mom? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that forced everyone in the yard to hold their breath to hear. You think he is the financial savior of this family. You are willing to help him steal a grieving widow's home just to maintain the illusion of his wealth. Let us see exactly what your successful son-in-law is hiding. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the thick envelope onto the same catered table where Trevor had thrown the forged will. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to the crystal champagne flutes. I looked at Trevor, watching the arrogant smirk finally completely melt away, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization that his entire house of cards was about to be burned to the ground in front of everyone he had spent the last 2 years manipulating. The heavy thud of the envelope against the catered table seemed to echo louder than the sharp crack of my mother's hand against my cheek. Trevor stared at the thick manila package as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I did not break eye contact with him for a single second. I stood my ground and told him exactly what was inside that envelope. I detailed the overdue notices, the final warnings from desperate creditors, and the massive balloon payments pending on the luxury vehicles he falsely claimed to own outright. I laid out the indisputable reality that his entire venture capital firm was nothing more than a hollow shell game, a fraudulent operation desperately seeking an immediate infusion of cash to avoid federal indictment. I told him I knew he needed the equity in my home not to secure his stepson's future, but to keep his own miserable life out of a federal prison cell. Trevor's face morphed from arrogant superiority to absolute unhinged fury. The veins in his forehead throbbed violently against his pale skin. But instead of showing any remorse or fear of being exposed, he leaned heavily into his aggression. He completely ignored the envelope, leaving it untouched on the table, desperate to maintain his dominant alpha facade in front of the watching congregation. He took another aggressive step toward me, his voice dropping to a dangerous gravelly whisper, meant only for me and my horrified parents to hear. He told me that nobody in this manicured yard cared about a stack of papers from a bitter, grieving widow. He reminded me of his powerful connections. He boasted about playing golf with the managing editors of the biggest publications in Atlanta and drinking premium scotch with the producers at the local news stations. He threatened to use every single favor he was owed to utterly annihilate my professional reputation. He promised to launch a media campaign so vicious and pervasive that my public relations firm would not survive the week. He swore he would paint a picture of a deranged, greedy woman who outright refused to honor her late husband's dying wish to provide for his innocent infant nephew. He promised to brand me across the entire city as a heartless monster stealing from an orphan. My mother immediately chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate as she grasped my arm again. She warned me that Trevor was not bluffing and that his connections could destroy us all. My father added his heavy pastoral weight, demanding I sign the forged deed immediately to save the church and our family from a catastrophic public scandal. They actually believed I would cower at the threat of bad press. They believed my fear of public shame was as paralyzing as theirs. I looked at the three of them standing there, united in their corruption. I felt no fear. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of clarity. I reached down and picked up the forged will Trevor had thrown at me. I slowly and deliberately ripped the heavy parchment in half. Then I put the pieces together and ripped them again. I let the torn shreds flutter down onto the expensive catering platters like toxic confetti. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation to the crowd. I simply offered Trevor a cold, knowing smile. I turned my back on my parents. I turned my back on my sister, who was still clutching her pearls in mock horror. I walked away from the stunned congregation. My heels clicked steadily against the stone patio, a rhythmic beat of absolute defiance. I walked straight through the sprawling backyard, ignoring the gasps and the frantic whispers of the church elders. I walked out through the heavy wrought iron gates, leaving them to deal with the suffocating silence and the thick envelope of undeniable truth I had left behind. But the calm of my dignified exit did not last. Monday morning arrived with a violent digital storm. I was sitting at my kitchen island nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at the empty chair where Marcus used to read the morning paper when my phone began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop. It was barely 7 o'clock in the morning, but my screen was completely filled with frantic text messages and missed calls from my senior staff members. I opened my internet browser and felt my stomach completely drop. Trevor had not bluffed. He had actually pulled the trigger on his threat. The headline of a prominent local digital news outlet screamed across my screen in bold, inescapable black letters. It framed a heartbreaking, sensationalized story of a beloved local attorney whose final dying wish was being callously ignored by his greedy estranged widow. The article did not use my full name, but it provided enough highly specific, identifying details about my public relations firm, my historic Beacon Hill home, and my husband's recent sudden passing that anyone in the Atlanta business community would instantly know it was me. The piece painted Trevor and Chloe as devastated, grieving family members desperately trying to secure a basic future for a fatherless child. It included fabricated quotes from anonymous sources claiming I had always been jealous of my sister's growing family and that my marriage had been on the rocks for years. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation and character assassination. Trevor had successfully leveraged every ounce of his unearned privilege to portray me as a cartoonish villain. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly devastating. My public relations agency was built entirely on trust, absolute integrity, and flawless image management. My corporate clients paid me exorbitant retainers to counsel them on how to avoid scandals and navigate media crises. Now I was the dead center of a massive, incredibly toxic public relations disaster. It was the ultimate professional irony, and Trevor knew exactly how lethal it would be. My business phone line rang. It was the chief executive officer of my largest account, a massive regional logistics company that constituted nearly 40% of my annual revenue. He did not bother exchanging pleasantries or offering condolences for my husband. He sounded deeply uncomfortable, but entirely resolute. He told me he had seen the article circulating widely on social media and professional networking sites. He said his board of directors was deeply concerned by the nature of the allegations. A company of their magnitude simply could not afford to be associated with an agency whose founder was actively being accused in the press of defrauding an infant out of an inheritance. He said they needed to pause our contract immediately, pending a full and transparent resolution of these disturbing claims. He hung up before I could even formulate a defense. Before I could even finish processing that devastating financial blow, my phone rang again. It was the director of a prominent children's charity I represented. She was almost in tears, explaining that their donor base was incredibly sensitive to issues involving child welfare. The mere suggestion that their lead PR consultant was stealing from an orphaned nephew was a risk they could not take. She officially terminated our contract on the spot. The dominoes were falling exactly as Trevor had maliciously planned. The carefully constructed empire I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building from scratch was crumbling hour by hour. By noon, I had received formal notices from 3 major clients pausing or outright terminating our agreements. My own staff members were sending panicked, fearful messages asking if our firm was going to survive the week, and if their paychecks were secure. The local media had picked up the digital story, and news vans were beginning to slowly circle my neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wicked widow of Beacon Hill. I sat alone in the house Marcus and I had built, listening to the suffocating silence of the empty rooms. The very house Trevor was actively trying to steal by destroying my ability to pay the mortgage. Trevor had set a masterful, suffocating trap. If I fought back publicly and aggressively, I would look exactly like the bitter, defensive, and unhinged widow he had described in the article. If I went to the press to expose his financial ruin, it would simply look like a desperate, retaliatory smear campaign from a guilty woman. But if I stayed silent and took the high road, I would lose my business, my reputation, and my entire livelihood. He had successfully weaponized my own industry against me. He had brilliantly used my parents' absolute obsession with public image to secure their backing, knowing they would gladly throw me to the wolves to protect the church's reputation. And he was currently using the court of public opinion to starve me into submission. It seemed like Trevor had won. My parents had chosen their side. I was completely isolated, sitting in a cold house watching my life's work vanish into thin air, while my husband's grave was barely settled. But I refused to remain a victim in my own narrative. Hiding away in my home would be the ultimate admission of guilt, a silent surrender to the fabricated reality Trevor had purchased in the local press. As a public relations expert, I knew that perception was reality for the masses, and running away only confirmed the worst accusations. I had to face them. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that mirrored the stifling anxiety gripping my chest. I put on a tailored charcoal suit, pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless bun, and drove straight to my father's megachurch. The parking lot was already overflowing, an ocean of luxury vehicles belonging to the 5,000 members who attended the early service. Walking through the massive glass double doors of the sanctuary, I immediately felt the severe drop in temperature, both from the aggressive air conditioning and the freezing stares of the congregation. The sanctuary was a cavernous state-of-the-art auditorium designed to broadcast my father's pristine image to the world. Giant high-definition screens flanked the pulpit, projecting every emotion, every tear, and every practiced smile. As I walked down the center aisle to my usual seat in the third row, the atmosphere grew instantly claustrophobic. It felt as though the walls were physically vibrating, closing in on me with every step. The rhythmic, joyful music of the choir seemed to fade into a distorted buzz in my ears. Ushers who had known me since I was a toddler in Sunday school abruptly turned their backs. Older women in the congregation, women who had attended my wedding and eaten cake in my home, leaned together in their pews, shielding their mouths with their programs as they whispered fiercely about the wicked, greedy widow who had walked into the house of the Lord. I sat down, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my eyes fixed straight ahead. The air was thick and heavy, making it difficult to pull a full breath into my lungs. Then my father took the stage. Pastor Thomas approached the acrylic podium, his face a masterful canvas of pastoral sorrow and righteous burden. The congregation hushed instantly, hanging on his every breath. He spoke for 20 minutes about the trials of modern families, about the insidious nature of greed, and the destructive power of selfishness. Every word was a thinly veiled precision-guided missile aimed directly at my reputation. And then he did the unthinkable. He invited my sister and her husband onto the pulpit. Chloe walked up the carpeted steps wearing a modest, high-necked dress, clutching a tissue in one hand and leaning heavily on Trevor. Trevor stood slightly in front of her, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. He perfectly embodied the role he loved most, the wealthy, benevolent white savior, valiantly shielding his fragile, fractured black family from the cruelties of the world. He looked out over the sea of African-American faces in the congregation with a sickening, paternalistic pride soaking up their admiring glances. Chloe took the microphone. Her voice trembled flawlessly. She did not mention the house directly, nor did she mention the forged will. She spoke in careful, legally vetted euphemisms crafted by Trevor's crisis team. She wept about the tragedy of losing Marcus. She cried about the heavy burden of single motherhood and the terrifying uncertainty of securing a future for her innocent baby boy. She spoke about the agonizing pain of family division and the heartbreak of being turned away by those who should have offered love and shelter. She paused, wiping a solitary, perfectly timed crocodile tear from her cheek. She looked directly down at me in the third row, her voice amplifying through the massive speakers. She asked the church to pray for her sister. She asked them to pray that God would soften my hardened heart, that I would find peace in my grief, and that I would eventually choose family over material wealth. A collective resonant amen echoed through the auditorium. The sound crashed over me like a physical wave. Over 5,000 people, my own community, the very people I had grown up with, completely turned their backs on me. They looked at me with undisguised contempt and pity. My parents stood behind Chloe, nodding solemnly, sanctioning my public execution. Trevor squeezed Chloe's shoulder, looking down at me with a smirk so deeply arrogant it made my blood run cold. They had successfully weaponized the sanctuary. They had used my father's sacred pulpit to legitimize their theft and finalize my excommunication. I did not wait for the benediction. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and walked back up the center aisle. The silence that followed my exit was deafening, broken only by the sharp, steady click of my heels on the marble floor. By the time I reached the safety of my car, the psychological toll of the morning had manifested into physical symptoms. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock my door. My phone buzzed in my purse, a harsh grating sound in the quiet vehicle. I pulled it out, expecting another client cancellation. Instead, my screen was lit up with a rapid succession of text messages from an unsaved number. I knew instantly who it was. The messages from Trevor read like a manifesto of his suffocating savior complex. "Did you enjoy the sermon, Naomi? I told you exactly what would happen if you challenged me. You cannot fight my protection over this family. Your parents know exactly who actually provides for them and who secures their future. They know I am the only reason Chloe has the life she deserves. You should have just signed the house over quietly. Now you will have absolutely nothing. Black women like you always think you can do everything entirely alone. You think your little business makes you invincible. Your PR firm is dead by Tuesday. Sign the deed, apologize to your sister, and I might consider making this all go away." I stared at the glowing screen, reading his racist, condescending taunts over and over. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed that stripping away my clients, turning my parents against me, and publicly humiliating me in my own church would break my spirit. Any amateur public relations agent would have taken the bait. A lesser strategist would have instantly logged onto social media, typed out a furious emotional rebuttal, and posted a desperate video crying about the injustice of it all. They would have gone to the local news stations, begging to tell their side of the story, engaging in a messy public screaming match that would only serve to validate Trevor's narrative that I was unhinged. I did none of those things. I put my car in drive and drove back to Beacon Hill. Monday morning brought the economic devastation Trevor had promised. My firm was bleeding out rapidly. 2 more mid-sized corporate clients terminated their retainers by 9 a.m. My lead account executive, a woman I had mentored for 3 years, walked into my office, placed her resignation letter on my desk, and apologized, stating she simply could not have her professional name tied to my current public scandal. The bank holding the line of credit for my business operations called to nervously schedule an unexpected financial review. The trap Trevor had set was executing perfectly systematically, destroying the financial independence he despised so much. I walked into my private office and locked the heavy oak door. I drew the blinds, shutting out the bright Atlanta sunlight. I sat down at my desk and placed my smartphone face down on the glass surface. I pulled out a secure encrypted laptop that I use strictly for confidential corporate investigations. Trevor thought he was dealing with a wounded emotional sister-in-law. He forgot he had picked a fight with a woman who made a highly lucrative living dismantling corporate frauds and navigating hostile takeovers. I knew that fighting a lie with the truth in the court of public opinion was a losing battle when the enemy had a head start. I did not need public sympathy. I needed federal indictments. I needed a paper trail so solid, so irrefutable, and so legally damning that no amount of church sermons or white savior complex could save him from the Department of Justice. I opened my encrypted email client and composed two highly sensitive messages. The first was to a man named Silas. Silas was a former federal investigator turned private detective who operated strictly in the shadows of corporate espionage. He charged an exorbitant hourly rate, and he was worth every single penny. I had used his services twice before to quietly unearth the hidden offshore accounts of rival corporate executives who were attempting to blackmail my clients. I gave Silas Trevor's full legal name, his supposed business addresses, and the names of every single shell company I had found in the initial documents I had thrown on the table at the birthday party. I told Silas I needed absolute verification of Trevor's debt, a complete tracing of his fraudulent loans, and definitive proof that his venture capital firm was a Ponzi scheme. The second message went to Evelyn Vance. Evelyn was a senior forensic auditor who specialized in tracking stolen assets and identifying forged legal documents. She was ruthless, brilliant, and feared by every corrupt accountant in the state of Georgia. I attached high-resolution scans of the forged will Trevor had presented to me. I requested a full expedited forensic analysis of the signature, the notary stamp, and the specific phrasing of the document. I needed legally admissible proof that the document was fabricated after Marcus's death. I hit send on both emails and closed the laptop. The silence in my office was profound, a sharp contrast to the chaotic collapse of my professional life happening just outside my door. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the small crack in the blinds at the sprawling city of Atlanta. Trevor wanted to play a high-stakes game of destruction. He wanted to steal my home and parade my grief for his own financial salvation. He had successfully taken my family, my community, and my clients. But I was about to take his freedom. The sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my mahogany desk. I stepped away from my encrypted laptop and walked over to the small wet bar in the corner of my office, pouring myself a heavy, generous measure of a bold, dark Cabernet. I brought the crystal glass to my lips, the cool rim grounding me in the present moment. If anyone had looked closely into my eyes right then, they would not have seen a broken, defeated, or hysterical widow. They would have seen absolute calculating ice. It was time to play the game exactly how Trevor expected me to play it. In public relations, when dealing with a hostile, narcissistic adversary, the most effective strategy is often to give them precisely what their ego demands until they hang themselves with their own arrogance. I picked up my smartphone and dialed my father's number. I knew exactly where they would all be. It was Sunday evening, which meant Sunday family dinner at my parents' sprawling pastoral estate was in full swing. When my father answered, I did not speak immediately. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow, rapid, and ragged. I let a manufactured, pathetic sob catch in the back of my throat. "Dad," I whispered, injecting my voice with a heavy dose of sheer exhaustion and defeat. "I cannot do this anymore. I am done." I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed immediately by the rustling of the phone being placed on speaker. They were all there gathered around the polished dining room table, eagerly leaning in to listen to my surrender. "Naomi." My mother's voice filtered through the speaker, dripping with a sickening blend of fake maternal concern and barely concealed triumph. "Are you finally coming to your senses? The media pressure is completely destroying my business." I cried, letting another perfectly timed sob break my sentence. "My clients are leaving. My staff is panicking. I am entirely alone, Mom. I cannot fight this public humiliation anymore." "You were right. You were all right. I will sign the deed over to Chloe and Trevor. I just want this nightmare to be over." A heavy, satisfied silence hung over the phone line for a fraction of a second before Trevor's voice boomed through the receiver. He was practically vibrating with victory, his tone oozing with that familiar, sickening white savior complex. "It is about time you realized you cannot fight the protection I provide for this family, Naomi." Trevor gloated, relishing every single syllable. "You thought your little local PR agency made you invincible. You thought you could stand in the way of what is best for my nephew. You do not have the stamina for the big leagues. I told you I would ruin you if you fought me, and look at you now, crying on the phone, begging to surrender. I squeezed my eyes shut, not from tears, but from the sheer effort it took to suppress a laugh. I kept my voice weak, trembling, the absolute picture of a broken woman. You win, Trevor. I will transfer the property. Just tell me what I need to do to make the press back off. We are not doing this quietly in some back alley notary office. Trevor snapped back, his ego demanding a grand, humiliating spectacle. You are going to agree to a formal legal mediation, and we are doing it at Sterling Vance and Associates. I recognized the name immediately. It was the most cutthroat, obscenely expensive corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta. Trevor wanted to flex his perceived power. He wanted to drag me into a pristine, glass-walled boardroom in the sky and watch me surrender my $800,000 home, surrounded by $3,000 an hour attorneys. He wanted to crush my spirit in the most intimidating environment possible. Bring whatever discount lawyer you can still afford, assuming you have any money left to pay them. Trevor sneered. We will meet this Wednesday at 10 in the morning. Do not be late, Naomi, and do not try any last-minute PR stunts. I own the narrative now. I will be there, I whispered meekly. I am sorry for the trouble I caused the family. See that you are, my father added coldly before abruptly ending the call. I lowered the phone from my ear, wiped away a non-existent tear, and took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my Cabernet. They had swallowed the bait whole. By acting like a wounded animal, I had successfully lulled Trevor into a false sense of absolute security. He believed his media trap had broken me, which meant he would walk into that mediation room completely unprepared for the slaughter. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent preparation. I let my public relations firm continue to look like a sinking ship. I instructed my remaining staff to forward all media inquiries to a generic voicemail and told them to work from home until further notice. I did not issue a single press release. I did not post a single defensive statement on social media. I allowed Trevor to bask in the absolute, unquestioned certainty of his victory. Then, on Wednesday morning, just 2 hours before the scheduled mediation, a secure armored courier arrived at the front door of my Beacon Hill estate. He handed me a heavy tamper-evident package. The return address simply read, Silas. I carried the thick, sealed file to my kitchen island, my pulse maintaining a steady, lethal rhythm. I used a silver letter opener to slice through the heavy tape. Inside, Silas had delivered a masterpiece of forensic destruction. There were hundreds of pages detailing Trevor's catastrophic financial ruin, bank statements showing massive delinquent balloon payments, evidence of shell companies funneling non-existent venture capital funds to pay off aggressive high-interest personal debts. Evelyn Vance, the forensic auditor, had also delivered her expedited report, complete with a sworn legal affidavit proving unequivocally that the will Trevor had presented was a post-mortem digital fabrication. But the most devastating weapon in the package was not the financial audit or the forgery report. It was a secondary, highly confidential manila envelope from a private expedited genetics laboratory. During the chaotic, suffocating aftermath of Chloe's ridiculous paternity announcement at the birthday party, amidst the dramatic gasps, the shouting, and the stinging slap from my mother, no one had paid attention to my hands. When Trevor had aggressively stepped into my face, and my parents had formed their united wall of opposition against me, I had briefly leaned back against the catering table to steady myself. No one had noticed my hand brush past Lucas's high chair. No one had seen me swiftly, expertly slip the baby's discarded pacifier into a sterile plastic evidence bag that I always kept tucked inside my designer purse, a habit picked up from years of managing messy, unpredictable corporate scandals. I broke the seal on the laboratory report. My eyes scanned past the complex genetic markers, the alleles, and the scientific jargon, dropping straight down to the definitive, legally binding conclusion printed at the bottom of the page. The truth staring back at me was even more deliciously destructive than I had originally anticipated. I traced the bold black letters with my index finger, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Trevor thought he was walking into a boardroom to strip me of my wealth and my dignity. He thought he was the apex predator in a room full of sheep. I carefully placed the DNA results back into the manila envelope and tucked the entire explosive arsenal into my leather briefcase. Let the games begin. The glass doors of Sterling Vance and Associates parted silently as I stepped onto the top floor of the high-rise building. The reception area was an imposing display of dark mahogany and imported Italian marble, designed specifically to intimidate opposing counsel and drain the confidence of anyone walking in on the defensive. Trevor had undoubtedly chosen this venue to make me feel small. He wanted to remind me of the power, the connections, and the unyielding dominance he falsely claimed to wield over my life. I adjusted my grip on my leather briefcase, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the documents inside. I did not feel small. I felt like a predator stepping into a carefully baited cage. I was escorted into a sprawling glass-walled conference room overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense, the aggressive air conditioning doing absolutely nothing to cut through the thick hostility radiating from the other side of the massive oak table. Trevor sat at the dead center, leaning back in his leather chair with his suit jacket unbuttoned, projecting an aura of absolute unearned dominion. Chloe sat beside him, clutching a designer tissue, playing the role of the reluctant but entitled victim to absolute perfection. My parents flanked them like loyal foot soldiers. My father's jaw was set in stern disapproval, and my mother sat with her arms crossed, refusing to even meet my eyes. Next to Trevor sat a man who reeked of expensive cologne and predatory arrogance. This was his high-priced attorney, a man clearly brought in to execute the final bloodless slaughter of my assets. I took my seat across from them. My attorney, a sharp, fiercely intelligent litigator named David, sat quietly beside me. He opened his minimalist portfolio and waited. The dynamic in the room was palpable. I felt as though I was slowly, methodically circling them, an invisible net tightening around the table with every passing second. They looked at my calm demeanor and entirely mistook my silence for submission. Trevor's lawyer did not bother with professional pleasantries. He launched immediately into a condescending, practiced monologue about family duty, moral obligations, and the wisdom of avoiding prolonged, ugly litigation. He slid a thick, heavily tabbed binder across the polished wood of the table. He stated that in exchange for keeping the matter out of probate court and saving my public relations firm from further devastating media scrutiny, they had drawn up a comprehensive final settlement. But Trevor was not satisfied with just stealing the equity in my home. Greed is a bottomless pit, and Trevor's fragile ego demanded complete, humiliating annihilation. The lawyer adjusted his gold cufflinks and delivered the new staggering demand. He stated that since Marcus clearly intended to secure his infant nephew's future, the house alone was no longer sufficient. They were now officially claiming 50% of Marcus's life insurance policy. Trevor sat forward, a predatory, victorious smirk playing on his lips, daring me to protest. He wanted half of the safety net my husband had built for me. He wanted the cash required to keep his failing venture capital firm out of bankruptcy, and he was using my dead husband's name to extort it. My mother finally looked at me, giving a sharp, definitive nod, silently demanding my total capitulation. My father cleared his throat, adding with his heavy pastoral tone that signing over the funds was the only righteous path to redeem myself in the eyes of the family and our church congregation. I did not react to the extortion. I did not raise my voice or show a single flicker of the rage simmering just beneath my skin. I simply turned to David and gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. David adjusted his glasses and smoothly intercepted the binder, pushing it to the side of the table. He informed Trevor's attorney that before we finalized any transfer of physical assets or insurance payouts, standard legal due diligence was required. He pulled a single crisp document from his folder and placed it directly in front of Trevor and Chloe. David explained in a measured clinical tone that it was a standard affidavit of authenticity and financial disclosure. He stated that because they were claiming a massive portion of Marcus's estate based on a recently discovered, previously undisclosed will, they needed to legally attest to the absolute validity of that document. Furthermore, they needed to swear to their current financial transparency, confirming on the record that this claim was not motivated by undisclosed personal debts, impending bankruptcies, or financial fraud. David made it unequivocally clear that they were signing this document under penalty of perjury, a federal offense carrying severe, unavoidable criminal consequences. Trevor laughed. It was a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed sharply off the glass walls. He looked at David as if my lawyer were a nuisance insect buzzing around his head. Trevor genuinely believed this was a desperate, pathetic delay tactic from a beaten woman trying to save face in a room full of powerful men. He mocked me openly, asking if this single piece of paper was supposed to scare him away from what was rightfully his. Without bothering to read a single line of the legal jargon, without consulting his expensive attorney, who was suddenly looking a bit wary, Trevor snatched a heavy gold pen from his breast pocket. He aggressively slashed his signature across the bottom line, pressing so hard the paper nearly tore. He then pushed the document toward Chloe. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting to my mother for reassurance. My mother whispered a sharp, impatient encouragement. Chloe picked up the pen and signed her name right next to Trevor's. They pushed the signed document back across the table. Trevor leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head, looking entirely pleased with his own dominance. He asked with a sneer if I was finally ready to stop playing games and sign over the life insurance. I reached into my briefcase. I bypassed the sealed DNA results and the forensic audit of Trevor's shattered venture capital firm. I pulled out a single thin manila folder and placed it deliberately in the exact center of the table. I looked directly into Trevor's smug eyes, holding his gaze as the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The game had not just begun. For him, it was already over. I opened the folder to reveal a high-resolution magnified copy of the forged will he had thrown at me during the birthday party. I kept my voice dangerously calm, the words slicing clearly through the suffocating tension in the room. I pointed to the bottom of the page, right next to the notary seal Trevor had illegally purchased. I read the date of the signature aloud for everyone in the room to hear. Then I reached back into the folder. I pulled out a certified copy of Marcus's passport and a stamped, verifiable corporate flight manifest, sliding them right next to the fabricated will. I watched the color rapidly drain from Trevor's face, his arrogant smirk melting into absolute terror as I pointed out the fatal amateur mistake in his masterpiece of fraud. I informed the breathless room that on the exact day Marcus supposedly sat in an Atlanta office and signed away our home to his nephew, my husband was physically standing in a corporate boardroom in Tokyo, Japan. The silence in the glass-walled conference room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a catastrophic physical impact. From my vantage point, looking directly across the polished mahogany table, I watched the arrogant, untouchable mask slide right off Trevor's face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly shade of pale. The vein in his neck that had been throbbing with aggressive confidence just moments prior was now pulsing with sheer, unadulterated panic. Beside him, his $3,000 an hour attorney suddenly stopped breathing. A seasoned litigator knows exactly what federal fraud looks like, and he knew instantly that he had just been used to present a fabricated legal document in a formal mediation. The lawyer slowly, deliberately pushed his chair a few inches away from Trevor, physically distancing himself from the radioactive epicenter of a federal crime. He closed his expensive leather binder, his eyes fixed firmly on the table, completely abandoning his client. But I was not finished. The forgery was merely the appetizer. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the thick, meticulously compiled audit provided by Silas. I dropped it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that made my mother flinch in her seat. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. I kept my voice surgical cold and entirely devoid of emotion. I looked at Trevor and methodically stripped away every single layer of his meticulously crafted identity. I told the room that Trevor was not a venture capitalist. He was not a wealthy, benevolent savior swooping in to rescue my grieving sister. He was a textbook grifter. He was a charlatan, wearing a bespoke suit, playing a high-stakes game of financial smoke and mirrors. I opened the audit and read the numbers aloud. I detailed the $2 million in crippling, inescapable debt he had accrued. I read the names of the offshore gambling syndicates he owed money to, the disastrous, non-existent ghost projects he had funneled investor money into, and the massive balloon payments that were currently defaulting. I exposed the absolute truth: his entire life was a Ponzi scheme on the verge of a spectacular criminal collapse. He did not want my house and Marcus's life insurance to secure a future for his stepson. He needed liquid cash immediately to keep his kneecaps intact and his body out of a federal penitentiary. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at her husband. She looked at him as if he were a complete stranger, the illusion of her wealthy, secure life shattering into a million jagged pieces around her. But the most profound reaction did not come from my sister. It came from my father. Pastor Thomas, the towering righteous moral authority of a 5,000-member megachurch, began to hyperventilate. He clutched the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His chest heaved erratically under his tailored suit. I looked at him, truly looked at the man who had stood on a pulpit just days ago and sanctioned my public execution. He was not looking at the forgery. He was staring directly at the audit file, his eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the shock of his son-in-law being exposed as a fraud. My mother grabbed his arm, her voice shrill and panicked, asking him what was wrong, demanding to know if he was having a heart attack. He could not even look at her. He kept his horrified gaze locked on the financial documents detailing Trevor's ghost investments. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. The absolute desperation my parents had shown to force me into signing over the house. The way my father had blindly championed Trevor, elevating him, treating him as the ultimate financial authority. My father had not just been blinded by Trevor's whiteness and his fabricated wealth, he had bought into it, literally. I kept my eyes locked on my father. I asked him, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, exactly how much of the church's building fund he had given to Trevor. My mother shrieked a sound of pure, unhinged denial, ordering me to stop speaking such blasphemy. But my father's reaction was all the confirmation anyone needed. He slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands. A guttural, agonizing groan escaped his lips. The picture was completely clear. My father, the man who preached weekly about the sins of greed, had secretly embezzled from his own congregation. He had taken the tithes and offerings of thousands of hardworking people and handed them over to his white son-in-law, entirely seduced by the promise of stepping into the ultra-rich elite financial circles of Atlanta. Trevor had promised him astronomical returns, generational wealth, and unparalleled power. Instead, Trevor had taken the church's money and flushed it down an offshore gambling drain. My father had thrown me to the wolves, allowed my reputation to be dragged through the mud, and tried to help steal my home, all because he was desperately trying to keep Trevor afloat. If Trevor went down, the missing church funds would be discovered. My father would lose his pulpit, his freedom, and his entire legacy. He had sold his own daughter out to cover up his own massive, devastating corruption. My mother began to weep hysterically. The pristine, dignified image she had guarded her entire life, completely disintegrating in a matter of seconds. She hit my father's shoulder, demanding he tell her it was a lie, demanding he explain where the money had gone. The room devolved into absolute chaos. The pristine, intimidating glass boardroom had become a tomb for my family's reputation. Through the weeping and the hyperventilating, Trevor suddenly snapped. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous, and Trevor was entirely out of options. His fake wealth was exposed. His legal threats were neutralized by his own felony forgery. His powerful father-in-law was destroyed. But his ego simply could not allow him to surrender to a woman he viewed as inferior. He violently slammed his fist down onto the heavy mahogany table. The loud crack silenced my mother's weeping instantly. He shot up from his chair skidding backward and crashing into the glass wall behind him. His face was a mask of unhinged, desperate fury. The veins in his neck bulged, and his eyes were wild with cornered aggression. He leaned over the table, pointing a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. He abandoned the calm, calculating savior persona and reverted to pure, venomous entitlement. He roared that none of this financial detail mattered. He screamed that I had no right to sit there and judge him, no right to withhold the assets that rightfully belonged to his family. He shouted that regardless of the forgery, regardless of the debt, and regardless of the church funds, I owed them that money. He slammed his hand on the table again, his voice echoing violently in the enclosed space. He bellowed that the law would protect an orphan child. He screamed that the baby was Marcus's biological son, that Marcus's own blood flowed through the boy's veins, and that no judge in the entire state of Georgia would ever let a bitter, barren widow keep an inheritance away from her dead husband's rightful blood heir. He demanded I hand over the assets, immediately threatening to drag the baby into court and force a public agonizing legal battle that would definitively prove the child's paternity and destroy me anyway. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I let the echoes of his furious, desperate roar fade into the cold air of the boardroom. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my charcoal suit, projecting absolute, unshakable calm against his frantic chaos. I reached into my leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out the sealed manila envelope containing the expedited genetic laboratory report. I did not break eye contact with Trevor. I raised the envelope slightly, letting the heavy, undeniable weight of the truth hang between us. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed the thick DNA file onto the center of the table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood, coming to a stop directly over the forged will and the damning financial audit. I looked at Trevor, my voice an icy, razor-sharp blade. Let the games begin. I slid the heavy certified laboratory report across the polished mahogany. The entire axis of the room seemed to violently tilt, an invisible shift in gravity that threw everyone but me completely off balance. David, my attorney, sat back with a faint, knowing smirk, content to let me execute the final strike. Trevor stared at the manila envelope as if it were a live grenade. He did not reach for it. He kept his hands flat on the table, his knuckles turning white as he tried to maintain his facade of impenetrable superiority. I reached out, flipped the thick cover open, and spun the document around so it faced him directly. I explained the methodology with the clinical, merciless precision of a surgeon dissecting a corpse. I detailed exactly how I had acquired the pacifier at the birthday party. I watched Chloe's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated panic as she realized her own careless negligence had handed me the very weapon of her destruction. I read the first highlighted paragraph aloud, letting the words echo in the stifling quiet of the glass-walled boardroom. There was a 0% probability that my late husband Marcus was the biological father of her child. Trevor let out a harsh, barking laugh, attempting to project confidence through the cold sweat rapidly beading on his forehead. He pounded his fist on the table, declaring that the test was a desperate, illegal stunt. He shouted that the forged will was still the only document that mattered and commanded his lawyer to shut this circus down. But his lawyer did not move a muscle. He was already leaning over the table, his eyes locked on the certified, heavily embossed seals of one of the most accredited independent genetic laboratories in the country. The lawyer knew a bulletproof legal document when he saw one. I held up my hand, silencing Trevor's frantic, escalating blustering. I told him he needed to turn to the second page. I explained that when I hire forensic experts, I do not pay for incomplete investigations. I told the room how Silas, my exceptionally thorough private investigator, had noticed something highly irregular about Chloe's daily routine while tracking Trevor's financial ruin. Silas had tracked her movements, pulled her hidden credit card statements, and documented her daily 3-hour visits to the ultra-exclusive Platinum-tier fitness club downtown, a club that Trevor proudly paid for to maintain his wife's trophy status. I painted the picture for the breathless room. I named the specific personal trainer. I detailed the man's background and his athletic build. I explained how Silas had easily acquired a discarded sports drink bottle from this trainer outside the gym, and how I had also managed to discreetly swab the rim of the premium Scotch glass Trevor had so arrogantly left on the catering table at the birthday party. I had submitted all 3 samples to the lab: the pacifier, the water bottle, and the Scotch glass. I instructed Trevor to read the final line of the second page. The probability of Trevor being the biological father of the infant was exactly 0%. The probability of the personal trainer being the father was 99.9%. Chloe had not just lied to me to steal my historic home and Marcus's life insurance. She had been systematically, routinely lying to Trevor since the day they met. She had carried another man's child, brought it into his home, and allowed him to parade the boy around as the rightful heir to his fabricated empire. The physical reaction that consumed Trevor was terrifying to witness. The total catastrophic destruction of his ego happened in real time. The wealthy, benevolent white savior who had paraded his beautiful black wife and mixed-race child around as trophies to prove his progressive superiority had been utterly played. The realization that he was a bankrupt, cuckolded fraud broke his mind completely. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a dark, twisting contortion of pure malice. He turned his head slowly toward Chloe, his breathing becoming heavy and ragged. Chloe pressed herself flat against the high back of her leather chair, her face a mask of absolute terror. She held her trembling hands up in front of her chest, trying to stammer out an excuse, her voice reduced to a pathetic high-pitched squeak. Trevor snapped. He lunged across the armrests with the feral, unhinged violence of a cornered predator. He grabbed Chloe by the throat, driving her backward and pinning her violently against the glass wall of the boardroom. The expensive, civilized veneer of the corporate law firm was instantly shattered by his roaring, guttural screams. Trevor did not just yell. He unleashed a torrent of the most vile, horrific, deeply seated racist slurs imaginable. He screamed about how she was filthy, how her entire family was nothing but pathetic, greedy trash that he had tried to elevate out of the gutter. He spat venomous, racially charged insults directly into her face, his heavy hands tightening ruthlessly around her neck. He revealed the dark, rotting core of his true nature, demonstrating precisely what he had always thought of my sister, my parents, and our entire community. He had never loved her. She was merely a prop for his monumental ego, and now that the prop was broken, he wanted to physically destroy it. My mother shrieked, a piercing, hysterical sound of pure horror that echoed down the corporate hallway. She scrambled out of her chair, her expensive pearls swinging wildly as she threw herself at Trevor, beating her fists against his broad back, screaming for him to let her daughter go. My father, jolted out of his catatonic state of financial shock, lunged forward alongside David and the opposing attorney. It took all three grown men to pry Trevor's hands off Chloe's neck. Trevor thrashed violently against them, knocking over a heavy silver tray of crystal water glasses. It crashed to the floor, exploding into a dangerous shower of shards and ice water. Trevor's attorney, panting heavily and aggressively adjusting his ruined tie, looked at the forged will. The financial audit proving his client was a bankrupt fraud, the damning DNA results, and the brutal physical assault that had just occurred in his firm's prestigious boardroom. Without uttering a single word to anyone, the lawyer packed his briefcase, turned on his heel, and sprinted out the glass doors, officially terminating his representation and fleeing the scene of multiple federal crimes. Trevor was shoved hard into the corner of the room by my father. He stood there with his chest heaving, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. He looked at the shattered glass, the weeping women, and the undeniable paper trail of his total annihilation sitting on the table. Knowing he was facing federal forgery charges, millions in insurmountable debt, and imminent assault charges, his cowardly survival instinct took over. He bolted. He pushed roughly past my father and ran out the door, leaving my sister coughing, gasping for air, and sobbing hysterically on the floor. The room fell into a heavy, traumatic silence, broken only by Chloe's ragged breathing and my mother's inconsolable weeping. I did not move to comfort them. I remained seated, my posture perfect, my hands neatly folded in my lap, watching the ruin I had orchestrated. My father stood alone in the center of the wreckage. He looked at the empty doorway where his wealthy white savior son-in-law had vanished. He slowly turned his head to look at the financial audit still resting on the mahogany table. It was the undeniable printed proof that the millions of dollars he had secretly funneled out of his church's building fund were completely gone, gambled away by the grifter he had worshipped. He slowly turned to face me. The righteous, booming pastor who had condemned me from his sacred pulpit just days ago was gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified, and broken old man staring down the barrel of a massive federal embezzlement indictment. He looked at me sitting perfectly calm in my chair, completely untouched by the chaos and the violence. He knew exactly what I did for a living. He knew I was a master crisis management expert. He knew I possessed the personal wealth, the ruthless connections, and the strategic brilliance required to cover up a catastrophic financial scandal before it reached the press. My father's knees buckled. He sank down onto the expensive water-soaked carpet right in front of my chair, ignoring the shards of broken crystal scattered around him. He clasped his hands together, raising them toward me in a posture of desperate, trembling prayer. He began to beg. He cried out that the church auditors were coming next month. He sobbed that he would lose his ministry, his reputation, his beautiful home, and his freedom if I did not help him replace the missing funds. The tears streamed down his weathered face as he invoked the name of God, pleading for Christian forgiveness. He begged me the daughter he had physically struck, publicly humiliated, and attempted to rob to open my checkbook and save his miserable life. I looked down at him. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no urge to offer grace to the man who had gladly thrown me to the wolves to protect his own greed. I slowly stood up, towering over the broken man, weeping at my feet. I picked up my briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, decisive click. I looked down into his terrified, pleading eyes and offered him a smile colder than a winter storm. "I am not finished yet, Dad." If a camera had been recording the events unfolding inside that glass-walled boardroom, the frame would have remained entirely static. The chaotic, kinetic violence of the past 10 minutes had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating glacial stillness. The absolute center of gravity in that room was no longer Trevor's loud, aggressive posturing or my mother's hysterical weeping. It was my absolute, unwavering calm. I stepped gracefully around my father's trembling form, my designer heels making sharp, rhythmic clicks against the damp carpet. I returned to my leather chair, taking my seat with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen ascending a throne. I smoothed the lapels of my suit, perfectly composed, while the rest of my family looked like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to floating debris. Trevor was slumped against the far wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as he stared at the floor. Chloe was curled into a tight, trembling ball in the corner, her face streaked with mascara and sheer terror. My mother sat frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the shattered crystal on the floor. My father remained on his knees, his hands clutching his chest, completely paralyzed by the impending doom of his ruined church legacy. "You all walked into this room today with a very specific, deeply flawed narrative." I began, my voice cutting through the heavy air with surgical precision. "You believe that because Marcus was a successful architect, he was the sole provider of our household. You believe that I was just the struggling, insignificant public relations wife surviving on his generous dime. You believed that by forging a will, you could effortlessly strip me of an $800,000 house and leave me destitute." I reached into my briefcase for the final time. I pulled out a single heavy legal document bound in a blue backing. I placed it perfectly parallel to the edge of the table, directly in my father's line of sight. "This entire extortion attempt," I said, looking at Trevor, whose bloodshot eyes slowly raised to meet mine, "was built on the fundamental assumption that Marcus owned the Beacon Hill estate. You assumed that because his name was on the mortgage, you could use his forged signature to steal the equity. But you made a critical error, Trevor. You never actually pulled the county property records. You just assumed you knew how the world worked." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the heavy blue document. "If you had bothered to do even the most basic legal due diligence before committing federal fraud, you would have discovered that Marcus's name has never been on the deed to that house. Marcus did not buy the Beacon Hill estate. He did not pay the property taxes. He did not fund the renovations." My father slowly raised his head, his tear-streaked face contorting in sheer confusion. He looked at the document, then back up at me. "The house is owned outright, free and clear, by a corporate trust," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. "A private, specialized real estate holding company called Blackstone Holdings." Trevor blinked, his exhausted mind struggling to process the legal terminology. He pushed himself slightly away from the wall, his brow furrowed. Blackstone Holdings. He rasped, his voice hoarse from his violent screaming. What does that even mean? Who owns the trust? I do, I replied, a slow, genuine smile finally touching my lips. I am the sole proprietor, the primary shareholder, and the exclusive beneficiary of Blackstone Holdings. The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer magnitude of my revelation struck the room with the force of a physical blow. I watched the gears turning in my parents' heads as they tried to reconcile the daughter they had relentlessly mocked with the reality sitting across from them. For the last 10 years, I continued, keeping my tone conversational but lethal. You all treated my career like a pathetic hobby. You sneered at my local PR firm. You told me I lacked ambition. You idolized Trevor because he leased luxury cars, wore custom suits, and threw around venture capital buzzwords. You worshipped the illusion of wealth while completely ignoring the reality of it. I looked directly at my mother, who was now staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. My public relations firm is not a struggling local boutique, I explained, educating them on the reality of the daughter they had discarded. I handle elite, highly confidential crisis management for Fortune 500 companies, disgraced politicians, and billionaire executives. I clean up corporate disasters that you never even see on the evening news because I am exceptionally good at making them disappear. My retainer fees are astronomical. I paused, letting the weight of my financial reality sink deep into their bones. I did not buy designer handbags or lease sports cars to impress my country club friends. I took every single dollar of profit I made over the last decade and quietly, anonymously funneled it into commercial and residential real estate. Blackstone Holdings owns the Beacon Hill estate. It owns a high-rise apartment complex in downtown Atlanta. It owns a strip of commercial retail space in Buckhead. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Trevor, delivering the final crushing blow to his fragile, shattered ego. I am a multimillionaire, Trevor. I have been for years. I hold more liquid capital in a single checking account than your entire fake venture capital firm has ever seen. You walked into this boardroom thinking you were a shark circling a wounded minnow, but you are just a desperate, bankrupt grifter who tried to steal pocket change from a whale. My father let out a low, agonizing sound. He was putting it all together. The daughter he had alienated, the daughter he had publicly shamed and abandoned, to side with a white con artist, was a legitimate, self-made titan. If he had only treated me with a fraction of the respect he had blindly handed to Trevor, he would have never needed to embezzle church funds. I could have funded his entire ministry with a stroke of my pen. He realized in that agonizing moment that his own prejudice and greed had completely destroyed his life. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The golden child who had married for status and wealth was now tied to a violent, bankrupt criminal, while the sister she had mocked stood untouchable at the pinnacle of success. Trevor stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization that he had been so profoundly outplayed, so entirely outclassed by a woman he viewed as inferior, finally broke whatever sanity he had left. His shoulders began to shake. A low, wet sound escaped his throat. It started as a cough, but quickly morphed into a dark, hysterical laugh. He slid his back down the glass wall, collapsing into a crouch on the floor, laughing maniacally into the silent room. The sound was ugly, desperate, and completely unhinged. He ran his hands through his disheveled hair, his eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at the ceiling as he cackled at the cosmic absurdity of his own destruction. "You think you won?" Trevor gasped out between bouts of hysterical laughter. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, his face twisted in a mask of pure chaotic malice. "You think because you have your little real estate empire and your DNA test that you get to walk away clean? You think keeping your house means you escape this?" He pushed himself up onto his knees, crawling slightly forward on the damp carpet, his eyes burning with a venomous, destructive fire. "I am going down," Trevor sneered, spitting the words out with vicious delight. "But I am not going down alone. My company is currently being seized. I defaulted on a massive loan, and the Vanguard Investment Fund is executing a hostile foreclosure on every single asset connected to my name by the end of this week. They are tearing my accounts apart." He turned his manic, burning gaze away from me and locked it directly onto my father, who was still kneeling on the floor. When Vanguard opens my books, Trevor hissed, his voice echoing with lethal promise, they are going to find the $2 million your righteous holy father quietly wired into my offshore accounts. When I declare federal bankruptcy tomorrow morning, I am going to list the First Baptist Church of Atlanta as an unsecured complicit investor in a fraudulent gambling syndicate. My father let out a choked, terrified cry, grabbing his chest as if he had been shot. Trevor laughed again, a harsh, grating sound of pure evil. I am going to drag your precious church fund right down into the mud with me. When the feds come for me, they are coming for him too. Trevor's maniacal laughter bounced off the pristine glass walls of the boardroom, a jarring, ugly sound that starkly contrasted with the terrified, suffocating silence of my parents. My father was gasping for air, clutching his chest, watching his entire legacy disintegrate before his eyes. My mother had slumped over the table, burying her face in her arms, utterly defeated by the monster she had welcomed into our family. Trevor stood there vibrating with a toxic mix of adrenaline and despair, completely convinced that his mutually assured destruction was the ultimate trump card. He believed that if he was going to drown, he was taking my father's church, my parents' reputation, and my family's standing down to the bottom of the ocean with him. I let his laughter run its course. I let the absolute horror settle deep into the bones of the people who had betrayed me. I did not interrupt the silence that followed. I simply sat in my chair, adjusting my posture with deliberate, agonizing slowness, and allowed a genuine, effortless smile to spread across my face. Trevor noticed my expression. His laughter died abruptly in his throat. His bloodshot eyes narrowed, searching my face for the panic, the devastation, or the plea for mercy he so desperately needed to see. He found nothing but cold, amused satisfaction. "What are you smiling at?" he spat, his voice dropping into a dangerous, paranoid growl. "Did you not hear a single word I just said? I am taking them all down." I picked up a sleek black remote control resting near the center of the mahogany table. I aimed it at the far wall of the conference room and pressed a single button. The heavy automated blinds hummed as they descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a cool, cinematic darkness. Another press of the button lowered a massive high-definition projection screen from the ceiling directly behind Trevor. "I heard every word, Trevor," I said, my voice cutting through the dim room with the absolute clarity of a polished diamond. "I have been hearing you for a very long time." I tapped the screen of my encrypted tablet, casting a highly classified financial dossier onto the glowing projector screen. The Vanguard Investment Fund logo appeared in bold, sharp letters towering over Trevor's shoulder like a digital guillotine. Trevor turned around, his eyes locking onto the familiar logo of the private equity firm that was actively dismembering his life. He stared at the screen, his breath hitching, unable to comprehend why I had access to the internal acquisition files of the corporate giant that was currently seizing his assets. "You have always been a careless man," I stated, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "You lease cars you cannot afford. You gamble with money you do not have. You steal from congregations that trust you. You forge legal documents without understanding the consequences. But your greatest, most fatal mistake was blinding yourself to the world right in front of you." I stopped right in front of him. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy matte black business card with raised gold lettering. I let it drop from my fingers. It landed on the mahogany table with a sharp, distinct clack. "Trevor, in all your desperate, panicked dealings over the last 6 months, did you ever once bother to read the names of the principal stakeholders at Vanguard?" I asked, watching his eyes drop to the card. "Did you ever look past the corporate shell companies and the offshore intermediaries to see who was actually buying up your delinquent debt?" Trevor stared at the card. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The raised gold letters stared back at him. Naomi Vance, Principal Director and Majority Shareholder, Vanguard Capital Acquisitions. I watched the last remaining shred of his sanity snap in half. The blood drained so completely from his face that his skin took on a translucent, waxy quality. His knees visibly buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the table just to keep himself standing. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently the word barely materialized in the air. It was you. It was always me, I confirmed, stepping closer, refusing to give him a single inch of breathing room. When you started spiraling into gambling debt 2 years ago, my forensic accountants flagged your liabilities. When you begged my father to dip into the church's building fund to cover your margin calls, my firm acquired the debt. I bought your fraudulent shell companies for pennies on the dollar. I bought the mortgage on your over-leveraged suburban mansion. I bought the predatory loans you took out from overseas syndicates. Vanguard is not some faceless corporate entity coming to destroy you, Trevor. Vanguard is me. The gravity of the situation slammed into the room with apocalyptic force. I was not just a grieving widow defending her home. I was the apex predator who owned the very cage they were all trapped in. I possessed the absolute power of life and death over every single asset, every bank account, and every property attached to his name. I turned my attention to my parents. They were staring at me as if I were a deity who had just descended from the sky to cast final judgment. You thought you could drag my father's church down with you, I said, my voice echoing off the walls as I looked back at Trevor. But you cannot liquidate assets you no longer control. As the primary holder of your debt, Vanguard has already seized your remaining equity. When you file for federal bankruptcy tomorrow, you will not have the power to list the First Baptist Church as a complicit investor. Why? Because 3 days ago, Vanguard legally absorbed that debt. The church's missing $2 million is no longer a federal crime waiting to be exposed by you. It is a private, secured liability held entirely by my holding company. I watched my father process the reality of his existence. His entire life, his public standing, his freedom, his pension, and his multi-million-dollar megachurch were no longer in the hands of a volatile con artist. They were resting squarely in the palm of the daughter he had emotionally abused, publicly shamed, and actively tried to rob. My mother let out a loud, shattering wail. The pristine, image-obsessed matriarch broke completely. She slid out of her expensive leather chair and dropped directly onto her knees on the floor. She crawled toward me, her designer dress soaking up the spilled water from the shattered crystal, completely oblivious to the indignity of her position. "Naomi, please," she sobbed, grasping desperately at the hem of my skirt. "Please, my baby, you have to save us. You have the power to fix all of this." My father fell to his knees right beside her. The great Pastor Thomas, a man who demanded total obedience from thousands of followers every Sunday, bowed his head to the carpet, weeping uncontrollably at my feet. "We are your family, Naomi," my father cried out, his voice thick with terror and shame. "We share the same blood. We raised you. We brought you into this world. You cannot let the church fall. You cannot let them take my ministry. Please, in the name of God, I am begging you for Christian forgiveness. Show us the mercy of the Lord. Do not take the church." They invoked God. They invoked family. They weaponized the very concepts they had used to manipulate and control me my entire life. They knelt in the wreckage of their own profound greed, begging the scapegoat to become their savior. I looked down at the two people who were supposed to protect me. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I felt an absolute liberating emptiness. "Family is a privilege, Mom," I said, taking a deliberate step back, forcing her to let go of my skirt. "A privilege you revoked the moment you chose his lies over my survival." I looked at my father, his face buried in his hands, shaking with genuine fear. "And do not dare invoke the name of God to cover up your theft, Dad. You did not steal from the church to feed the poor. You stole from your congregation because your vanity demanded a wealthy son-in-law, and you were willing to sacrifice your own daughter to keep the illusion alive." I turned back to the table, picking up my briefcase. I looked at Trevor, who was now sitting completely immobilized in his chair, staring blankly at the projection screen that detailed his absolute financial ruin. Chloe remained curled in the corner, paralyzed by the destruction of her fraudulent life. "The Vanguard foreclosure proceeds exactly as planned," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Trevor, you will vacate the property by Friday. My lawyers will send the federal authorities the evidence of your forgery and your offshore gambling fraud by the end of the business day. Chloe, you will be receiving notice of immediate eviction. As for the church," I paused, looking down at my weeping parents on the floor. The church debt remains on my books. I own the mortgage, I own the building fund, I own your pension. You will resign from the pulpit effective immediately. You will surrender all administrative control of the ministry. If you fight me or if you ever attempt to speak my name in public again, I will release the forensic audit to the congregation and the local news stations before you can even finish packing your office. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I did not look back at the wreckage. I did not need to. The predator had finished her meal and the cage was finally open. I paused with my hand resting against the cool steel handle of the boardroom door. The heavy, polished glass reflected the pathetic tableau behind me. I listened to the ragged, uneven sounds of their breathing and the soft, pitiful whimpers escaping my mother's throat. They actually believed I was going to simply walk away and leave them to sort out the wreckage of their own lives. They still did not understand the absolute finality of what was happening. I slowly turned back around. From where I stood looking down at the four of them scattered across the floor and slumped in their expensive chairs, they looked entirely insignificant. The grandiose illusions they had wrapped themselves in had been violently stripped away. I walked with deliberate, measured steps back to the head of the mahogany table commanding the center of the room one last time. I am not leaving this to chance, I stated, my voice ringing with a cold, terrifying authority. None of you get to walk out of this building and attempt to spin a new narrative. You are not going to hire discount lawyers to tie this up in civil court. We are ending this right here, right now, entirely on my terms. I opened my briefcase again and withdrew a thick stack of legally binding contracts my attorneys had prepared weeks in advance, anticipating exactly how this day would unfold. I tossed the first document directly onto the floor in front of Trevor. That is a sworn, legally binding confession, I told him, watching his bloodshot eyes track the paper as it landed near his knees. It details your forgery of Marcus's will, your attempt to extort an $800,000 property, and your comprehensive wire fraud regarding the offshore gambling accounts. You're going to sign it right now. Tomorrow morning, you will walk into the federal prosecutor's office downtown and turn yourself in. You will plead guilty to every single charge, and you will accept whatever federal sentence they hand down. Trevor stared at the document, his hands shaking violently. He opened his mouth to argue, a desperate animalistic instinct to survive fighting through his paralysis. You cannot force me to sign that. It is a guaranteed prison sentence. I will lose everything. You have already lost everything, I replied, my tone devoid of a single ounce of mercy. If you do not sign that confession right now, I will not just hand Vanguard's forensic audit to the authorities. I will hand it to the ruthless, unregulated overseas creditors you owe $2 million to. They do not operate through the federal court system, Trevor. They do not care about plea deals. They will find you, and they will extract their debt in ways that will make a federal penitentiary look like a luxury resort. Choose your cage. Trevor swallowed hard, a sickening sound of total defeat. He picked up the pen he had so arrogantly used to sign the perjury affidavit just an hour earlier. With a trembling, defeated hand, he signed his confession, legally sealing his own fate. I turned my attention to my sister. Chloe was pressing herself into the corner of the room. Her designer dress wrinkled her face, completely stripped of the entitled, grieving mother persona she had weaponized against me. Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, dismissive pitch. You brought a child born from a gym affair into my home and tried to use him to steal the legacy my husband built. You stood in my kitchen and told me I was barren while you plotted to rob me blind. Your eviction notice is already being filed. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fits into the trunk of your car and vacate the property. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter. If you attempt to take a single piece of furniture, a single appliance, or a single dime from the accounts tied to that house, I will have you arrested for grand larceny. Chloe let out a pathetic, broken sob, shaking her head wildly. Where am I supposed to go, Naomi? I have no money. Trevor's accounts are frozen. I have a baby. You cannot just throw me out into the street. We are sisters. We share blood, I corrected her coldly. We stopped being sisters the moment you forged a dead man's signature. Figure it out, Chloe. Ask your personal trainer for a place to crash. But you are entirely cut off from my wealth. Finally, I looked down at my parents. My father was still kneeling on the carpet, his hands clasped together, his face buried against his chest in absolute disgrace. My mother was sitting on the floor beside him, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face, staring at me as if I were a monster she no longer recognized. "As for the church," I said, addressing my father. He flinched at the word, his shoulders hiking up toward his ears. "You took the hard-earned money of thousands of faithful, trusting people and gambled it away to buy your way into a higher social class. You used your pulpit as a personal piggy bank. You do not get to ask God for a miracle when you are the one who engineered the disaster." I dropped the final set of documents onto the table above him. "Here are your conditions for staying out of federal prison," I instructed, my voice unwavering. "You will draft a letter of immediate, unconditional resignation from your position as senior pastor. You will cite failing health. You will step down completely from the ministry and the board of directors. Following that, you and Mom will immediately liquidate your entire joint retirement portfolio. You will put your pastoral estate on the market tomorrow morning. Every single dollar from your retirement, your savings, and the sale of your home will be transferred directly to Blackstone Holdings to cover the $2 million you stole from the church." My mother gasped, scrambling up to her knees, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You want to leave us with nothing? We worked our entire lives for that retirement. We will be destitute. You cannot take our home, Naomi. Where is your compassion? Where is your heart?" My heart was buried 3 months ago. I snapped back, my patience completely exhausted. "You did not show me an ounce of compassion when you sat in this room and tried to force me into giving up half my husband's life insurance. You did not care about my future when you actively supported Trevor's extortion. You chose your vanity over my survival. Now you will pay the price for that vanity." My father looked up at me, his eyes red and hollow. "Naomi, please. I am begging you. The scandal will destroy the congregation's faith. If I have to sell the house, everyone will know. Just give me time. I can rebuild the fund quietly. I can make this right." "You lost the right to rebuild anything the day you betrayed me," I stated, completely unmoved by his tears. "You sign the asset transfer, or I march downstairs and hand the Vanguard audit to the press. The local news stations will have a field day with the righteous pastor who embezzled millions to fund his white son-in-law's gambling addiction. You will lose the house anyway, but you will do it from a prison cell. Sign the papers." My father stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He looked for the obedient, desperate daughter who had always craved his approval. He found only a hardened, untouchable adversary. His hands shook violently as he reached up, pulled the asset transfer documents off the table, and signed his life away. My mother wept openly, covering her face as she signed her name beside his, officially signing away her wealth, her home, and her social standing. I gathered the signed confessions and the asset transfers, placing them meticulously back into my leather briefcase. I snapped the locks shut. The sharp metallic sound echoed loudly, signaling the absolute end of the slaughter. I picked up the briefcase and adjusted the strap of my purse, completely unburdened by the destruction I had just orchestrated. I looked at the 4 of them one last time. They were broken, penniless, and entirely stripped of the illusions that had fueled their arrogance. "I gave you all a chance to be a family," I said, my voice quiet, resolute, and echoing with absolute finality. "But you chose to be parasites." I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass doors. I did not look back at the wreckage, and I completely ignored the desperate, agonizing wails that erupted from the room as the heavy oak door swung shut behind me. The game was over, and I had won. The heavy, soundproofed glass doors of the boardroom swung shut abruptly, cutting off the pathetic, animalistic wails of my family. The thick seal clicked into place, and the chaotic symphony of their destruction was instantly muted, reduced to nothing more than a muffled, indistinct murmur behind me. If you were to view that exact moment from above, looking down through the ceiling of that prestigious law firm, you would see 4 people crawling on the floor, entirely stripped of their dignity, weeping over the shattered fragments of their fabricated lives. You would see them reduced to their smallest, most pathetic forms. But if you viewed it from the floor, looking up as I walked away, you would see a woman who had finally stepped entirely out of their toxic shadow. I walked down the polished corporate corridor with my head held high, my posture impeccable, and my designer heels clicking a steady rhythmic cadence of absolute victory. I felt 10 feet tall. I was a monolith of my own making, completely untouched by the wreckage I had left in my wake. I did not offer them a single ounce of mercy, because they had never offered me a single ounce of grace. I simply executed the contracts they had signed, and the wheels of my justice began to turn with devastating, irreversible speed. The very next morning, exactly as I had orchestrated, Trevor's hollow, fraudulent empire officially collapsed. The sun had barely risen over the city when he walked up the cold concrete steps of the federal prosecutor's office downtown. Silas, my exceptionally thorough private investigator, sat in a parked car across the street, documenting every miserable second of Trevor's surrender. There was no arrogant smirk on Trevor's face. There was no aggressive white savior posturing. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting suit, his skin pale and slick with the cold sweat of a man walking willingly to his own slaughter. He presented his sworn, legally binding confession to the federal agents detailing his forgery of Marcus's will and his massive offshore wire fraud. Because I held the absolute power to ruin him entirely through Vanguard, he did not fight. He accepted a plea deal that guaranteed a brutal 7-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The physical stripping of his ego happened in real time. He was forced to surrender his designer watch, his leather belt, and the shoelaces from his expensive Italian loafers. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and stripped of the custom-tailored identity he had used to manipulate my family. The heavy steel door of a holding cell slammed shut behind him, replacing his luxury penthouse with a sterile concrete box. The man who had violently pinned my sister against a glass wall just 24 hours earlier was now entirely powerless, locked away to rot in the absolute reality of his own actions. By Friday morning, the consequences of that boardroom meeting arrived at the doorstep of the Beacon Hill estate. Chloe had spent her entire life skating by on her golden child status, relying completely on her looks and her ability to manipulate those around her to secure a pampered, effortless existence. She had never faced a single real consequence. That streak ended the moment my private security team and the county sheriff arrived at the property to execute her immediate eviction. She stood in the grand foyer of the home she had tried to steal from me, screaming and crying as the security team handed her a stack of heavy-duty trash bags. She begged for more time. She tried to leverage her baby, crying that she was a mother and needed a place to stay. The sheriff simply pointed to the door. She had exactly 1 hour to pack whatever she could carry and leave. Chloe frantically dialed her wealthy country club friends, begging for a place to crash. Every single call went straight to voicemail. She called the personal trainer who had fathered her child, desperate for him to save her. He had already blocked her number, entirely uninterested in a woman who no longer had access to a multi-million-dollar bank account. She was forced to stuff her wrinkled designer dresses and her premium makeup into cheap black garbage bags. When the hour was up, she was escorted out of the iron gates of the estate. She stood on the public sidewalk holding a crying infant on her hip, surrounded by a pathetic pile of plastic bags. The beautiful, entitled sister who had sat in my kitchen and mocked my barren womb was now standing on the street, possessing absolutely nothing. She had thrown away the only sister who would have fiercely protected her, all for a fraction of an inheritance she never deserved. Now she was entirely invisible. But the most profound public collapse was reserved for my parents. They had built their entire existence on the currency of community respect. They worshipped their social standing above their own flesh and blood. To avoid federal embezzlement charges and protect my father from wearing a prison jumpsuit alongside Trevor, they had to swallow the bitter, agonizing pill of total public humiliation. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence inside the sprawling sanctuary of the First Baptist Church. My father stood behind the massive wooden pulpit, gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. The booming, righteous voice he used to command thousands of followers was completely gone, replaced by a weak, trembling whisper. He looked out at the massive congregation that trusted him and read his letter of immediate, unconditional resignation. He cited failing health, stepping down completely from the ministry and the board of directors. But in a community built on appearances, the truth always bleeds through the cracks. The moment my father stepped down the church, elders executed an emergency financial audit. The horrific realization swept through the pews like wildfire. The righteous pastor, who had aggressively condemned sinners from his sacred altar, was exposed as a common thief. The whispers started immediately growing into a loud, undeniable roar of betrayal. He had secretly funneled $2 million of the church's building fund to his fraudulent son-in-law, actively sacrificing his own congregation to maintain the illusion of his family's wealth. They were instantly and ruthlessly excommunicated. The community they had ruled and judged for decades turned their backs on them completely. Lifelong friends blocked their numbers. Grocery store clerks they had known for years suddenly refused to meet their eyes. They were entirely exiled from the only world that mattered to them. The financial ruin was absolute and meticulously enforced by my attorneys. Within 72 hours, my parents were forced to list their luxurious, sprawling pastoral estate for sale. They had to completely liquidate their joint retirement accounts, draining every single penny they had saved over 40 years. All of it, every last dollar from the sale of their home and the emptying of their pensions, was transferred directly to Blackstone Holdings to cover the massive debt they had incurred. They were forced to move out of their mansion and rent a tiny, outdated, poorly insulated one-bedroom apartment situated directly next to a noisy, elevated highway. The quiet, manicured serenity of their lost estate was permanently replaced by the constant grating roar of heavy traffic and rattling windows. My mother, a woman who used to dictate the social hierarchy of the church auxiliary board while draped in expensive pearls, now wears dark sunglasses and a pulled-down hat when she walks to the local laundromat, completely terrified of making eye contact with anyone who might recognize her fallen face. My father spends his days sitting in a cheap, worn-out recliner in their cramped living room, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. He is stripped of his title, his respect, his authority, and his wealth. He is a king sitting in a dungeon of his own making, entirely paralyzed by the crushing weight of his monumental failure. Every single morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, my secure phone carrier intercepts 2 blocked text messages. I know exactly who they are from. I know they are long, desperate paragraphs from my parents pleading for forgiveness. I know they are begging for a second chance, frantically invoking the bonds of family and asking me to rescue them from the miserable, suffocating reality they engineered for themselves. They cry out that they are sorry, that they finally see the error of their ways, that they want their daughter back. They do not know that I changed my personal phone number the moment I walked out of that boardroom. They are screaming into a digital void, endlessly seeking absolution from a daughter who simply no longer exists to them. I sit at the head of my own dining table, sipping a perfectly chilled glass of white wine, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. My posture is relaxed, my mind entirely unburdened. I look back on the wreckage they brought upon themselves, and I feel absolutely no remorse. I offered them grace, and they spat in my face. I offered them truth, and they chose a comfortable lie. I gave you all a chance to be a family, but you chose to be parasites.